The desert sun was ruthless, beating down on an endless stretch of cracked earth and faded memories. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like a mirage and left even the strongest souls questioning their next step. Cars zipped by on the nearby highway, their passengers tucked safely inside air-conditioned bubbles, barely noticing the lonely figure trudging along the dusty shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 16, a skinny girl in worn-out sneakers, an oversized backpack slung over her shoulder, and eyes that spoke of battles no child should have to fight. Her name was Lily. She was homeless, nameless to the world, just another shadow forgotten by a society too busy to look back. Miles ahead, in a gleaming black SUV, sat a man who had never known hunger, not really. Richard Sterling, one of the richest entrepreneurs in the country, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and printed in magazines, was on a drive he hadn't planned to take. Life had been good to Richard, or so it seemed. Money, power, influence, he had it all. Yet lately, an emptiness gnawed at him. A hollow ache that no luxury car, no grand mansion, and no expensive bottle of wine could fill. He told himself he was just tired. Maybe he needed a new project, a new challenge. But deep down, he knew it was something else, something he couldn't name. The universe has a strange way of putting the right people in the right place at the right time. Even when it makes no sense. Especially when it makes no sense. Richard's SUV roared down the highway, kicking up dust behind it. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about his latest deal, when he spotted someone in the distance. A small figure waving frantically at the side of the road. His first instinct was to ignore it. Not his problem. He had places to be, people to meet. Yet something, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fate, made him ease his foot off the gas. Lily's heart pounded as she watched the SUV slow down. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. Her water bottle was nearly empty. Her body ached with every step. She wasn't looking for a handout. She never did. All she needed was a little help, just a little kindness to get to the next town where, maybe, there'd be a shelter that hadn't yet turned her away. As the car rolled to a stop, a cloud of dust billowed around her, making her cough. She wiped her sleeve across her mouth, squinting against the glare, trying to look less desperate than she felt. The window rolled down, and for a moment their eyes met. Richard saw not just a homeless girl, but something raw and real. A look of determination, of resilience he hadn't seen in a very long time. He asked where she was headed. She gave him a place name so small and dusty he barely recognized it. He hesitated. He could hear the voice of caution in his mind. Don't get involved. Don't complicate your life. But another voice, quieter and deeper, whispered something else. He told her to get in. Lily hesitated, instinct screaming at her to be careful. But she was running out of options. So, clutching her backpack to her chest, she climbed into the passenger seat, keeping close to the door just in case. The cool air of the SUV was a shock to her overheated body, but she said nothing. She was used to discomfort. She was used to pretending she didn't need help. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft rattle of loose gravel beneath the tires. Richard glanced over at her, noticing how small she looked in the big leather seat. She wasn't begging or crying or even thanking him. She just sat there like someone who had learned long ago that gratitude often came with a price. The heat outside seemed to tighten its grip on the desert, pressing down heavier and heavier. That's when Richard's dashboard flashed a warning: engine overheating. He cursed under his breath. Voldays. He pulled off the road onto a patch of cracked earth and popped the hood, a cloud of steam hissing out immediately. Lily climbed out too, squinting up at the angry sun. "You need water," she said simply, pointing at the radiator. Richard gave a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, I'm a little short on that right now." Without a word, Lily opened her battered backpack and pulled out her precious water bottle. There wasn't much left, just a few gulps. She looked at it, then at the SUV, then at Richard. She unscrewed the cap and handed it to him. "It's not much, but it might help," she said. Richard stared at her, stunned. Here was a girl who clearly had nothing. No home. No family waiting for her. Probably not a dollar to her name. Yet she was offering him the last of what little she had without expecting anything in return. Something shifted in Richard in that moment. A crack in the polished armor he wore so well. A memory stirred. Something about how he had once started with nothing too. Back when dreams were more important than deals. Back when kindness mattered more than contracts. He took the water, poured it carefully into the radiator, and within a few minutes, the car sputtered back to life. Lily shrugged on her backpack, ready to keep walking. She hadn't asked for a ride. She hadn't asked for anything. That's just how the world worked for people like her. "Wait," Richard said, more forcefully than he meant to. "At least let me give you a lift to town." Lily paused. She looked up at him, studying his face, weighing his words, deciding whether or not to trust. Finally, she nodded once, and got back into the SUV. As they drove, the desert stretched out endlessly around them, a harsh reminder of how small and vulnerable they both were out there. Richard found himself asking questions. Where was she from? How had she ended up alone out here? Lily answered in short, guarded sentences, revealing just enough to keep him curious but not enough to let him in. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know yet, was that this simple act of kindness, this moment on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Because sometimes the people we think we are saving are the ones who end up saving us. And just when Richard thought the desert had shown him all its surprises, something happened that made him slam on the brakes. Something that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. Everything. About success. About kindness. About what truly makes a man rich. But that's where the real story begins. The SUV skidded slightly as Richard stomped on the brakes, the tires kicking up a thick cloud of dust. Lily gripped the door handle, her heart racing. Out in the middle of the empty road stood a figure, hunched over and barely moving. From a distance, it was hard to tell if it was a man, a woman, or something else entirely. The desert heat twisted shapes in strange ways, making everything feel just a little unreal. Richard cursed under his breath. He didn't like surprises, especially not the kind that came out of nowhere in the middle of a barren wasteland. But something about the way the figure swayed, the way it almost seemed to melt into the horizon, made it impossible to just drive away. Lily leaned forward in her seat, trying to get a better look. Her instincts, sharpened from years of living rough, told her something wasn't right. But she also knew better than anyone that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, someone just needed help. Without thinking, Richard threw the SUV into park and stepped out. The heat hit him like a wall. Lily hesitated, then followed him, clutching her backpack tightly. As they got closer, they could see it was a man, older, with sun-leathered skin and clothes so worn they were almost falling apart. He was muttering something, words that didn't quite make sense, and when he looked up, his eyes were glassy, lost. Richard asked if he was okay, but the man just pointed a trembling hand off into the distance. Richard and Lily followed his gaze, but all they could see was more sand, more emptiness. No buildings, no signs of life. Just endless desert stretching on forever. "We can't just leave him here," Lily said quietly, almost to herself. Richard felt that same uncomfortable pull inside him, the one that had made him stop for Lily in the first place. He was not a man who liked getting involved. His whole career had been built on keeping emotions out of business. But something about this day, this girl, this broken man in the desert, it all felt like it was happening for a reason he didn't yet understand. They helped the man to the SUV. He was weak, barely able to stand. Richard offered him a bottle of water from the back seat, and he drank greedily, spilling half of it down his shirt. Lily sat quietly, watching, her mind racing. She had seen people like him before. People who had been left behind by the world, forgotten by everyone who had once loved them. The man finally managed a few clear words. "They took it. They took it all. Left me for dead." Richard and Lily exchanged a glance. It was the kind of sentence that could mean anything or everything. Richard asked him who they were, but the man only shook his head, a look of fear flashing across his sunburnt face. Richard wasn't sure what to do next. The nearest town was still miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. The logical thing would be to drive into town, find a ranger or a cop, and hand the man over. Let someone else deal with it. That was the smart move. That was what Richard Sterling, businessman, would normally do. But the part of him that had been cracked open by Lily's small act of kindness couldn't just brush it off. They got back on the road, the SUV heavy with heat and unspoken questions. Lily kept sneaking glances at the old man. There was something about him, something familiar in the way he stared blankly out the window, as if haunted by something he couldn't outrun. After about 15 minutes of driving, Richard spotted a faded sign. Rest area, 2 miles. It wasn't much, probably just a few picnic tables and a broken vending machine, but it was something. Maybe they could find help there. When they pulled into the dusty parking lot, the place was empty. A few battered benches sat under a small metal awning, and an old payphone hung crookedly from its booth. Richard parked the SUV and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, like the desert itself was holding its breath. The old man muttered again, "Don't trust them. They smile but they lie." Richard stepped out, stretching his stiff legs. Lily followed, her backpack still slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the empty lot. The heat shimmered off the pavement, making everything look warped and uncertain. Richard walked over to the payphone, lifting the receiver. Not even a dial tone. He wasn't surprised. He pulled out his cell phone, no signal. Course. He turned back to the SUV and found Lily sitting on the bench next to the old man. She was talking to him softly, asking gentle questions, the way you might approach a frightened animal. Slowly, piece by piece, the man began to open up. His name was Walter. He had once owned a small ranch not far from here. A good life, simple and honest. But then they had come, slick men in shiny suits with promises of big money and easy living. They wanted his land. Said they needed it for a special project. When he refused, things got ugly. Strange accidents started happening. His crops failed. His cattle disappeared. Then one night, his house burned down while he was asleep inside. He barely escaped with his life. Richard listened, skeptical. It sounded like the kind of paranoid story you hear from people who have spent too long alone. But Lily listened differently. She knew what it felt like to be powerless, to be pushed out and forgotten. She believed him. Walter dug into his threadbare jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, pressing it into Lily's hand. She unfolded it carefully. It was a map, hand-drawn, lines shaky but deliberate. There were markings, strange symbols, and a big red X near a place labeled Dry Creek. Richard looked over her shoulder, frowning. "This is crazy," he said. "We need to get you to a hospital, old man." But Walter only shook his head, desperate. "They're watching. They don't want anyone to find it." Richard wanted to laugh it off, drive to the nearest gas station, call for help, and forget all about this nonsense. But he saw the way Lily clutched that map, how her knuckles turned white, and he realized something. She believed. And part of him, the part that hadn't been fully deadened by board meetings and bank accounts, wanted to believe too. Before he could say anything, a low rumble filled the air. Dust rose in the distance. A black SUV, much newer, much shinier than Richard's, sped toward the rest area, its windows tinted dark. Lily stood up quickly, shoving the map into her backpack. Walter's eyes widened in fear. "They're here," he whispered. Richard's stomach dropped. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but everything in his gut told him they didn't mean well. The black SUV pulled into the lot with a screech, blocking the exit. 3 men stepped out, all dressed in black, sunglasses hiding their eyes. They moved with the smooth confidence of people who were used to getting what they wanted. One of them smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said something very bad was about to happen. Richard instinctively moved in front of Lily, shielding her without even thinking. Walter tried to stand, but his legs gave out and he sank back onto the bench, trembling. The men walked toward them slowly, each step measured, deliberate. Richard's heart pounded in his ears. Lily's voice was a whisper beside him. What do we do? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. And the desert, hot and endless, watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The first man, tall and broad-shouldered, stopped just a few feet away. His polished boots kicked up little clouds of dust with each slow step. He tilted his head slightly, sizing up Richard, Lily, and the frail old man behind them. The desert sun glinted off the man's sunglasses, hiding whatever emotion might have been lurking in his eyes. But Richard didn't need to see them to feel the threat in the air. It was thick, humming just beneath the surface like a storm waiting to explode. "Afternoon," the man said casually. His voice too friendly, too smooth. "Looks like you've picked up a stray." Lily tightened her grip on her backpack. Richard stepped forward just a little, his body blocking her without even thinking about it. His instincts, the ones he usually kept buried beneath layers of business suits and boardroom deals, screamed at him that these men weren't here for small talk. The second man, thinner but with the same calculating smile, nodded toward Walter. "Old Walt's been getting confused lately, saying things he shouldn't. It's dangerous for a man in his condition to be wandering around out here." Richard didn't respond right away. He wasn't stupid. These men weren't government officials or good Samaritans. They were something else. Hired hands maybe, enforcers for someone powerful enough to make people disappear without a second thought. Walter's voice cracked behind him. "Don't listen to them. They'll bury the truth." The third man, standing slightly apart from the others, gave a small chuckle and adjusted his jacket, revealing the unmistakable outline of a weapon at his side. Not brandished, but visible enough to send a clear message. Richard's mind raced. If he handed Walter over, they'd be rid of their problem. They could drive away, pretend none of this ever happened. It would be the safe thing to do. The smart thing. But then he thought of Lily. Of the look in her eyes when she offered him her last sip of water. Of the quiet strength she carried, even when the world had tried so hard to break her. He couldn't show her that kindness only mattered when it was easy. Richard put a steady hand on Walter's shoulder and spoke. His voice calm but firm. "The man's not hurting anyone. We're just taking him to town. If you've got a problem, you can take it up with the sheriff." For a long moment, the desert held its breath. Then the lead man smiled wider, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure," he said, backing off a step. "No problem. We'll see you down the road." Without another word, the three men returned to their shiny black SUV, the tires spitting gravel as they tore off down the highway. Richard let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But he knew better than to relax. This wasn't over. Not even close. They piled back into the SUV, the engine rattling nervously as Richard steered them back onto the road. Lily glanced over her shoulder every few seconds, half expecting the black SUV to come roaring back at any moment. Walter was trembling, murmuring to himself, clutching the backpack Lily had helped him fill with water and scraps of food from the rest stop vending machine. "Dry Creek," Walter whispered again, tapping the map through the fabric of Lily's bag. "It's all there. Proof." Richard wanted to tell him to stop talking to save his breath, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him was curious now. What could be so important that men would threaten strangers in broad daylight to cover it up? Miles passed under the wheels. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked landscape. Lily finally broke the silence. "What if he's right?" she asked, her voice low. "What if there's something out there? Something they're trying to hide?" Richard gripped the wheel tighter. Or maybe he's just a scared old man who lost everything and made up a story to survive. But even as he said it, he didn't fully believe it. There were too many coincidences. Too much fear in Walter's broken voice. They reached a tiny gas station, little more than a shack with a rusted-out pump and a blinking open sign that looked like it hadn't been turned off in years. Richard pulled in, needing gas, needing to think. Inside, the place smelled like stale coffee and motor oil. The attendant, an old man with a gray beard and a trucker hat, barely looked up from his newspaper. Lily wandered toward a dusty rack of maps while Richard filled the tank. Walter stayed in the car, mumbling to himself. "Dry Creek," Lily said suddenly, her finger tapping a spot on the worn paper. "It's real. It's not just in his head." Richard wiped his hands on a rag and peered over her shoulder. It was there, a tiny dot in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty land. The attendant shuffled over. "You headed out that way?" he asked, his voice rough. "Just curious," Richard said lightly. The old man shook his head. "Ain't nothing out there anymore. Used to be a mining town back in the 60s. Dried up. Abandoned. Folks say it's cursed." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Cursed?" The attendant gave a humorless laugh. "You know, strange stuff. People disappearing. Lights in the hills. Some folks say it's government experiments. Others say it's worse. All I know is, you couldn't pay me enough to go out there after dark." He shuffled back to his counter, leaving Richard and Lily staring at each other. The puzzle pieces were sliding into place, but the picture was still a mess of shadows and half-truths. Richard could walk away. He could take Lily and Walter to the nearest town, drop them off at a shelter, and go back to his world of safe deals and polished lies. But the desert had already changed him. Lily had already changed him. And some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. They climbed back into the SUV, the gas station fading into the distance behind them. The road ahead was cracked and broken, leading straight into the heart of nowhere. Walter stirred. "They buried it," he muttered. "Buried the truth deep. But it's still there." Lily pulled the crumpled map from her backpack and spread it across her lap. The red X seemed to pulse under the fading sunlight, like a heartbeat calling them forward. Richard tightened his hands on the wheel. Ahead, the desert darkened, shadows growing long and strange, the horizon swallowing the sun whole. Behind them, in the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights appeared, far off but closing the distance. The black SUV was back. And this time it didn't look like they planned to just talk. The race toward Dry Creek had begun. And the truth waiting out there in the desert was something far more dangerous than Richard Sterling could have ever imagined. Richard's heart pounded as he pushed the gas pedal harder. The old SUV rattled, the engine whining like it couldn't quite keep up. Lily gripped the dashboard with one hand, the other clutching Walter's map tight against her chest. The headlights behind them grew closer, cutting through the creeping desert darkness like knives. Dust kicked up in their wake, swirling into ghostly shapes in the rearview mirror. "They're getting closer," Lily shouted, her voice shaking. Richard didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the broken road ahead. Every mile felt like a gamble. Potholes yawned like traps, and every bump threatened to send the aging vehicle flying off the crumbling asphalt. But he couldn't slow down. Not now. Not with whatever waited behind them. Walter stirred in the back seat, his voice barely a whisper. "Dry Creek. You have to reach Dry Creek before them. They can't have it." Richard didn't know exactly what it was. He didn't know if it was gold, documents, secrets buried in some forgotten building. But he knew deep down that whatever it was, it mattered more than he could understand yet. And Lily knew it too. He could see it in her wide, determined eyes. The black SUV behind them suddenly swerved, trying to flank them. Richard jerked the wheel to the left, sending their car bouncing violently across the uneven road. Lily cried out as the map slipped from her fingers, fluttering around the cab like a trapped bird. Walter scrabbled for it desperately, his fingers trembling. Another jolt. The black SUV had bumped them, sending a harsh metallic shudder through the frame. "They're trying to push us off the road," Lily gasped. Richard gritted his teeth, refusing to let fear take over. "Hold on." Up ahead, the road split. One path led toward a cluster of craggy hills, the other dipped down into a narrow rocky pass. Richard made a split-second decision and veered right, down the pass. Rocks sprayed behind them, pelting the black SUV. It skidded for a moment but then corrected course, still in pursuit. The rocky pass was tight, with towering stone walls on either side. Shadows danced across the jagged surfaces, giving everything an eerie, half-alive look. It was almost night now, the last hints of daylight bleeding away, and with each second the desert grew more wild, more untamed. Walter suddenly leaned forward, grabbing Richard's shoulder with surprising strength. "There's a way, a back entrance, old service road. Just past the big Joshua tree." Richard's mind raced. An old service road might be their only chance. But in this light, spotting a single tree among the rocks and sand would be almost impossible. Still, he pressed on, squinting into the gloom, searching for anything that matched Walter's description. His hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly. Behind them, the black SUV's headlights bobbed and weaved, growing more aggressive. They were running out of time. And there, up ahead, bathed in the ghostly glow of the rising moon, a twisted ancient Joshua tree stood like a skeletal hand reaching out of the earth. "I see it!" Richard shouted. He yanked the wheel hard, sending their SUV off the main path and onto a rough, barely there trail that twisted into the hills. The tires struggled for traction, slipping on loose rocks and sand. The black SUV followed, its engine roaring like a beast, determined not to lose them. The trail narrowed even more. Brush scraped against the sides of the SUV, the noise like fingernails on glass. Branches clawed at the windows. Richard could barely keep the vehicle straight, and every bounce threatened to flip them over. The climb grew steeper. The desert opened up around them again, revealing the first broken remains of a town. Collapsed buildings, rusty fences, skeletal remains of old mining rigs silhouetted against the starry sky. Dry Creek. But the place looked dead. Not just abandoned, completely forgotten. Dust and time had claimed every inch. Richard didn't have time to wonder about the details. He slammed the brakes, skidding to a halt near what looked like an old courthouse or town hall. The roof caved in on one side. The black SUV screeched to a stop a few yards behind them. Doors flew open. 3 figures emerged, weapons drawn this time. No more hiding behind fake smiles. "Get out!" the lead man barked, gun aimed steady at Richard's head. Richard threw a protective arm in front of Lily as she tried to shield Walter, who was shaking uncontrollably now. The men approached slowly, confidently, the crunch of their boots loud in the heavy silence. "You should have stayed out of this," the leader said, voice cold. Walter struggled to his feet, his face pale but his eyes burning with something fierce. "You can kill me, but the truth's already out there. You can't stop it." The second man laughed, a short, cruel sound. "Old man, no one cares about your stories." But Lily stepped forward, her small figure standing defiant between them and Walter. "We care," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "We care enough to find out." Richard's heart twisted at the sight of her, a girl who had lost everything, standing up to men who saw her as nothing. The lead man sneered and cocked his gun. "Then you'll all disappear together." A sudden rumble shook the ground, soft at first but growing stronger. Dust spilled from the cracked buildings. The men froze, glancing around nervously. From the hill behind the courthouse, a low, strange light began to glow, faint but growing brighter. It wasn't natural, not moonlight or headlights. It was something else. Something ancient and powerful. Walter smiled through his fear. "You hear that?" he whispered. They woke it up. The lead man barked something to his partners, but even their confident stances faltered. One of them stumbled back toward the SUV, his gun shaking in his hand. The light grew, painting the ruins of Dry Creek in a sickly, shimmering glow. A hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground, through their bones. Richard shielded his eyes, heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground, feeling Lily press against his side, her small hand gripping his. The leader turned his gun toward the light for a split second, and that was all Richard needed. Without thinking, Richard grabbed the nearest chunk of metal debris from the ground and hurled it at the man's arm. The weapon clattered from his grip. "Run!" Richard shouted. Lily yanked Walter's arm, and they sprinted toward the nearest intact building, the ruins swallowing them up just as the desert exploded into chaos behind them. But as they stumbled into the darkness, Richard knew this was far from over. The real danger had just begun. The crumbling building they ducked into smelled of old wood, dust, and something metallic lingering in the stale air. Richard slammed his shoulder against the door, forcing it shut. It wouldn't hold long against anyone determined, but it gave them a moment to breathe. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening for footsteps outside, but for a few seconds, there was only the distant pulsing hum of that strange light still washing over Dry Creek. Walter slumped heavily against the wall, gasping. Lily dropped to her knees beside him, her face pale in the flickering moonlight leaking through broken windows. Richard scanned the room. It looked like it had once been a records office. Dusty file cabinets, broken desks, papers scattered like fallen leaves. The glow outside grew stronger, seeping through the cracks in the walls. Richard turned to Walter, his voice low but urgent. "What is out there, Walter? What did they bury?" Walter's eyes were wide, glassy with memories he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. His voice cracked as he answered. "It's not just documents, not just gold. They found something out here. Back when the mines went deeper than they should have. Something that wasn't meant to be unearthed." Richard frowned. "Something like what?" Before Walter could answer, a loud crash shook the building. One of the armed men had kicked in a side door. The beam of a flashlight swept the room. Richard grabbed Lily and Walter, pulling them deeper into the shadows. They could hear the men shouting now, arguing outside. But there was something else, a new sound layered under their voices. A low, rattling whisper, like hundreds of voices speaking all at once, just at the edge of hearing. Lily clutched Richard's sleeve, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not just them," she whispered. Richard nodded slowly. He felt it too. Something ancient was stirring. And it wasn't on their side. The flashlight beams passed over a stack of old ledgers on a half-collapsed desk. Lily pointed frantically. Richard grabbed one at random and flipped it open, scanning the brittle pages. Mining reports, land purchases. And then something different. A series of coded notes, strange symbols that didn't match anything he recognized. Walter wheezed beside him, struggling to sit up straighter. The miners. They found a cavern. Not natural, man-made. Or older, sealed off. They brought up pieces. Artifacts. Then the disappearances started. The sickness. The government moved in, but it wasn't to help. It was to cover it up. Richard's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about corruption or money. This was about something far bigger, something they had stumbled into by accident, and now couldn't escape. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the sound deafening inside the fragile building. A bullet slammed into the wall inches from Richard's head, sending splinters flying. He shoved Lily and Walter toward a back exit. He spotted half buried behind a toppled cabinet. "Go!" he shouted. They bolted through the crumbling hallway, the floorboards groaning dangerously under their weight. The whispering sound grew louder, and with it came an unnatural cold, like winter winds clawing at their skin despite the desert heat. They burst out into the open again, gasping. The black SUV was abandoned now, its doors hanging open. But the strange light was closer than ever, pouring from a crack in the earth itself, a fissure that hadn't been there when they arrived. From the crack a shape was emerging. No clear form, just a shifting, writhing mass of shadows and light, too strange for the mind to fully comprehend. The three men who had been chasing them now stood frozen before it, their weapons forgotten, their faces twisted in terror. Richard didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed Walter under one arm and Lily's hand with the other and ran. But as they stumbled across the cracked town square, another figure stepped into their path, a woman in a tattered uniform, her face pale and her eyes hollow. Richard skidded to a halt, shielding Lily and Walter behind him. The woman smiled, but it was a broken, chilling smile. "You can't leave," she said softly, her voice echoing weirdly in the heavy air. "It's already inside you." Richard backed away slowly. "We don't want trouble," he said, even as his heart raced. She took a step closer. "You don't understand. None of you do. You think you're here by accident." Her gaze locked onto Richard's. "You were brought here." The words hit him harder than any bullet. Brought here. Not chance. Not coincidence. Every twist of the road, every desperate choice. It was part of something larger. Some design he couldn't see yet. The woman raised a trembling hand, pointing past them toward the cracked earth. "It's awake now. And it remembers." Behind them, the ground rumbled again, louder this time, throwing Richard off balance. Walter collapsed to his knees, clutching his head and moaning. Lily screamed as fissures split the ground, cutting off their retreat. Richard spun around, searching for a way out. Any way out. But Dry Creek wasn't letting them go so easily. The light from the fissure grew blinding. The whispering became a roar, filling Richard's mind with half-formed images. Strange symbols, ancient cities buried beneath sand, creatures that defied understanding. He shook his head violently, trying to clear it. They had to move. They had to survive. But as Richard tightened his grip on Lily's hand and hauled Walter to his feet, a realization clawed its way through the terror. They hadn't been led here to uncover a secret. They had been led here to awaken it. And now the desert, the cursed, forgotten desert, had claimed them too. The ground shook so violently now that Richard could barely stay on his feet. Lily clung to him, her face buried against his side, while Walter, pale and trembling, stood with his eyes locked on the blinding fissure. The three men who had once hunted them were nowhere to be seen, either swallowed by the light or by their own terror. Richard didn't know and didn't want to find out. They had only seconds to make a decision that would decide everything. The woman in the tattered uniform still stood between them and the broken path leading out of Dry Creek. She didn't move, but her voice cut through the roaring air as if it were spoken right beside them. "There's only one way to end this," she said. "It needs a choice. A sacrifice." Richard stared at her, the words making his stomach drop. All this time he had thought this was about survival, about escape. But survival wasn't enough. The desert wanted more. Demanded more. Walter, leaning heavily on Lily's shoulder, suddenly pushed himself forward, standing straighter than he had all night. His voice was low but steady. "I brought them here. I should be the one to stay." "No," Lily cried, grabbing his arm. "You're the only reason we even made it this far." Walter smiled at her gently, his weathered face lined with both sorrow and pride. "You still have your whole life ahead of you, kid. This old desert's had me for a long time. It's just time I answered." Richard's heart twisted painfully. "There has to be another way," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. The woman only shook her head, a sad, knowing smile on her lips. Walter stepped toward the light, each footfall sending small clouds of dust spiraling upward. He pulled something from his pocket, the crumpled, half-burned map. He held it up for Richard and Lily to see one last time. "This was never about finding treasure," Walter said. "It was about remembering. Remembering the cost of forgetting." With one final look back at them, he dropped the map into the growing fissure. The second it touched the light, everything changed. The rumbling stopped. The fissures froze in place. The sickly glow faded until only the stars remained, cold and clear above them. And where the woman in uniform had stood, there was nothing now but dust swirling in the wind. Richard fell to his knees, pulling Lily close, both of them gasping, shaking. Walter was gone. They sat there for a long moment, the weight of what had happened settling on their shoulders. Dry Creek was silent again. The strange energy that had once filled the air now completely vanished. When they finally stood and stumbled back toward the SUV, Richard couldn't help but glance once over his shoulder. Nothing moved. It was as if the town had never woken at all, like it was waiting for the next chapter in its long, haunted story. The drive back through the desert was slow and hollow. Lily sat quietly, the map's last burned edges still clutched in her small hand. Neither of them spoke much. There weren't really words big enough to hold what they had just lived through. Hours later, they found themselves back in a tiny gas station on the outskirts of the desert, blinking against the bright fluorescent lights and the normal hum of a world that had no idea what had just been narrowly avoided. Richard leaned heavily against the counter as the clerk rang up some water and food, giving them a polite but puzzled look. They must have looked like ghosts. As they sat outside under the gas station awning, sharing a bottle of water and staring at the horizon, Richard finally spoke. "You saved me, you know." Lily looked up at him, her eyes still guarded but softer now. "You saved me first." He smiled a little, feeling a strange kind of peace settle into him. He had come into the desert lost, thinking only about himself, his broken life, his failures. But somehow, through Lily, through Walter, he had found something bigger, a chance to be part of something, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. But just as Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself believe it was over, a soft sound caught his ear, the faintest whisper carried by the desert wind. He opened his eyes sharply, scanning the empty lot. No one was there. Then Lily, who had been quietly staring at the map's scorched remains, pointed at something. Richard leaned over to see. On the last corner of the paper, right beneath where the town's name had been, a new symbol had appeared, burned into the paper itself, something they hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a map. It was a key. And written beneath the symbol, in jagged, trembling letters, was a single chilling message. Dry Creek was just the beginning. Richard felt a cold knot tighten in his chest as he looked out at the endless desert stretching ahead. Whatever they thought they had left behind was still out there, and it was waiting for them. Richard stared at the burned edge of the map, his fingers running over the strange symbol without even realizing it. The wind picked up again, warm and dry, carrying the same faint whisper that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Beside him, Lily pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. She didn't say anything, but her eyes stayed locked on the horizon, where the desert stretched on forever, empty and endless. For a long while they just sat there, the gas station buzzing softly behind them, the world going on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. It almost made Richard laugh. How people could live their whole lives, never knowing how close the world came to losing its balance because of a forgotten place like Dry Creek. Finally, he broke the silence. "We should go home," he said, though even as he said it, the word felt strange on his tongue. Home didn't mean what it used to anymore. Lily nodded, but her face stayed serious. "Where is home now?" Richard looked at her, this girl who had been a stranger just days ago. In so many ways she had saved him, not just out there in the desert but from himself. He reached out and gently ruffled her hair, making her give him a small, tired smile. "Wherever we make it," he said. They climbed back into the SUV. The engine coughed once, then roared to life, like even it was relieved to be leaving that cursed land behind. As Richard steered them back onto the cracked highway, he caught a final glimpse of the map out of the corner of his eye. He thought about throwing it away, burning it completely this time. But something deep inside him said to keep it. Not out of fear, out of respect. The drive was long and quiet. They passed through small towns that looked almost identical to each other, places with faded signs, leaning telephone poles, and dusty sidewalks. Life moved slowly out here. People nodded from porches, kids played in dirt yards, stray dogs chased the occasional truck down the road. The normalcy was comforting, like slipping back into a familiar worn jacket after being out in the storm too long. Richard found an old motel a few hours later, the kind with buzzing neon lights and a soda machine that looked like it hadn't been refilled in decades. They checked in, no questions asked. The clerk barely looked up from his newspaper. Inside the small room, Lily fell asleep almost immediately, curled up on the bed still fully clothed. Richard sat by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot, the symbol from the map burned into his mind. He thought about Walter. About the woman in the uniform. About the men who had chased them, thinking they were after gold or secrets, never realizing the true cost. And he thought about Dry Creek, sleeping once more beneath the sands. Somewhere between exhaustion and the weight of everything he'd seen, Richard realized something simple but powerful. Some places, some things are better left untouched. Not everything buried needs to be found. And not every story needs an ending. The next morning, with the sun beating down and the desert stretching in all directions, Richard made a decision. He and Lily would keep moving at least for a while. Maybe head toward the coast. Maybe find a small town where nobody asked too many questions. Somewhere they could heal. Somewhere they could live. Over breakfast, dry cereal and watery coffee at a diner that smelled like old bacon grease, Richard looked across the table at Lily. She was tracing a pattern into the condensation on her glass. Her mind clearly far away. "You ever think about what you want to do?" he asked casually. She shrugged. "Don't know. Never really thought I'd have the chance." "You do now," Richard said. "You've got a future, Lily. Whatever you want it to be." She smiled, a real one this time, small but growing. Maybe something with animals. Or music. She looked up, her eyes shining a little. "Maybe help people who get lost." Richard's throat tightened. He nodded. "I think you'd be good at that." They finished their meal and got back on the road. As they drove, Richard noticed Lily kept looking out the window, watching the desert slip away behind them like a dream already fading. A few hours later they pulled into a bigger town. Real grocery stores, real schools, the smell of the ocean somewhere close by. Felt different. Felt possible. Richard found a used bookstore while Lily explored a nearby park. As he wandered the aisles, picking up old novels and travel guides, a small leather-bound journal caught his eye. No title, just worn pages and a soft cover. He bought it without really knowing why. That night, sitting on the tiny balcony of another motel room, Richard opened the journal and started writing. Not everything. Some parts of Dry Creek were too big, too strange to put into words. But he wrote about Walter, about kindness, about how sometimes the smallest acts, a homeless girl offering a stranger a sip of water in the middle of nowhere, could change everything. He wrote about second chances. He wrote about hope. And somewhere along the way, Richard realized that the story wasn't just about surviving something terrible. It was about what came after. About how, even in the aftermath of fear and darkness, people could find new ways to live, to heal, to help each other. Weeks turned into months. Richard and Lily found a small apartment above a bakery. Richard got a job fixing cars. Lily enrolled in school. She played guitar on weekends at a coffee shop, the same 3 songs over and over until she got brave enough to add new ones. They never forgot Dry Creek. They never forgot Walter. But they didn't live in the shadow of it either. Sometimes Richard would hear the whisper of the desert in his dreams, feel the heat on his skin, see the cracked earth stretching forever. But when he woke up, there would be laughter downstairs, or the smell of bread baking, or the soft strumming of Lily's guitar. Life didn't erase the past. It built on it. And somewhere in the bottom of a drawer, wrapped in an old handkerchief, the burned map sat quietly, waiting. Not as a threat, but as a reminder that even in the harshest places, even against impossible odds, kindness could take root. And sometimes it could change everything.